Welcome, mercenaries, to a journey through the chaotic, fourth-wall-breaking world of Wade Wilson. Tonight, we're going to explore the complete story of Deadpool, from his tragic origins as a dying man to his evolution into Marvel's most unpredictable anti-hero. This is a tale that spans decades of publication, countless regenerations, and the very boundaries of comic book storytelling itself. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift as we walk together through the blood-soaked, wisecracking adventures of the Merc with a Mouth. There's no rush here, no need to memorize every quip. Just let the story wash over you like the healing factor that gave our anti-hero his powers. Our story begins not with costumes or superpowers, but with a man whose life seemed destined for tragedy from the very beginning. Wade Wilson's early years were marked by abandonment, loss, and the kind of casual cruelty that shapes a person's soul in ways that never quite heal completely. The details of his childhood shift and change depending on who's telling the story, and Wade himself has offered multiple versions over the years, each one contradicting the last, with the casual indifference of someone who's learned that the truth is often less important than the story you need to tell yourself to keep going. In one version of his past, Wade recalled that his father abandoned his pregnant mother, leaving her to raise their child alone, while nursing a bitterness that eventually turned toward the boy himself. The young Wade became the target of his mother's anger and frustration, a convenient scapegoat for all the disappointments and broken dreams that had accumulated in their small, suffocating world. This early experience of being unwanted, of being seen as a burden rather than a blessing, would echo through every relationship Wade formed for the rest of his life. But like all of Wade's stories, this one came with alternatives. Sometimes he would tell people that his mother died when he was only 5 years old, leaving him in the care of a father who was an army officer struggling with his own demons. In this version, grief transformed his father into an abusive tyrant who used his military training to discipline a small boy who was already drowning in loss and confusion. The violence that would later define Wade's professional life perhaps had its roots in those early lessons about power and helplessness, about the way strong people could hurt weak ones, simply because they could. Yet, another story painted his father as a failed comedian, a man who told bad jokes and abandoned his family not out of malice, but out of simple inadequacy. In this telling, Wade's mother turned to alcohol, home shopping networks, and bitter humor as coping mechanisms, creating a household where laughter was always tinged with desperation, and every joke carried the weight of unspoken pain. Wade believed, in this version, that he had run away from home to spare his mother the financial burden of caring for him, an act of childhood heroism that revealed the core of decency that would persist even through his darkest transformations. The truth, as it so often is with Wade Wilson, proved to be both simpler and more complex than any of his stories. When he eventually returned to Canada as an adult, he found his parents still alive, still together, still keeping his childhood room exactly as he had left it. But Wade himself couldn't recognize them, couldn't connect these ordinary, loving people with the narratives of abandonment and abuse that had shaped his understanding of himself. The disconnect was so complete that it suggested something deeper than mere forgetfulness, perhaps a psychological defense mechanism that had rewritten his history to make sense of the pain he carried, or perhaps the kind of dissociation that comes from trauma too deep to face directly. Whatever the truth of his childhood, Wade's adolescence was marked by a restless energy and a moral compass that pointed in directions his environment couldn't understand or accommodate. When he came of age, he made the choice that seemed most natural for a young man with his particular combination of talents, frustrations, and need to prove himself. He joined the United States Army Special Forces, where his superior skills, quickly became apparent to his commanding officers. The military should have been a perfect fit for someone with Wade's combination of physical abilities, tactical intelligence, and need for structure. He excelled in training, demonstrated exceptional marksmanship, and showed the kind of quick thinking under pressure that marked him as officer material. But the same moral core that would later complicate his career as a mercenary created problems in an institution that valued following orders above individual conscience. Wade's dismissal from the military came not from lack of skill or courage, but from his repeated refusal to follow orders that conflicted with his personal sense of right and wrong. While his fellow soldiers learned to compartmentalize, to separate their personal values from their professional duties, Wade found himself unable or unwilling to make that separation. His superiors saw this as a dangerous lack of discipline, but it was actually the first clear expression of the ethical framework that would guide him through his most morally complex adventures. The period immediately following his military discharge was marked by depression, confusion, and a failed suicide attempt that came just before his 19th birthday. Wade found himself adrift in a world that seemed to have no place for someone with his particular combination of skills and scruples. The suicide attempt wasn't just a cry for help. It was a genuine recognition that he couldn't see a path forward that didn't compromise everything he believed in. It was his military record, combined with his obvious desperation, that brought him to the attention of a clandestine group of CIA-sponsored mercenary assassins who promised him something he desperately needed, a sense of purpose and the assurance that his targets would be people who deserved death. This organization offered Wade what the regular military couldn't: moral clarity in a morally complex world. The promise that his considerable skills could be used in service of justice rather than politics. The years that followed were marked by a series of international assignments that took Wade far from the small-town American environment where he'd grown up. His first major deployment was to Tangier, Morocco, where he began a relationship with a woman named Francie. This romance represented Wade's first serious attempt at building something lasting and meaningful in his adult life. But like so many of his early relationships, it was doomed by the fundamental incompatibility between the life he was living and the life he wanted to live. When the relationship with Francie ended, Wade found himself traveling to Japan, where he was hired by a crime lord known simply as the Boss, to infiltrate a sumo wrestling organization owned by a rival criminal called the Oyakata. This assignment would prove to be transformative in ways that went far beyond its professional requirements. For 3 years, Wade lived as a wrestler under the Oyakata's training, learning not just the physical techniques of the sport, but also its philosophical underpinnings and cultural significance. During this time, Wade became romantically involved with his mentor's daughter, a relationship that offered him a glimpse of what his life might look like if he could find a way to step away from the violence and moral ambiguity that had defined his career. The young woman represented everything Wade had never had: stability, acceptance, and the possibility of being valued for something other than his ability to kill people efficiently. The assignment in Japan came to an abrupt end when the boss ordered Wade to assassinate the Oyakata, the man who had become both his mentor and something approaching a father figure. For the first time in his professional career, Wade refused a direct order, walking away from both the mission and the life he had built, rather than betraying someone who had shown him genuine kindness and respect. This decision marked a crucial turning point in Wade's moral development. While he had always maintained certain ethical boundaries, his refusal to kill the Oyakata represented the first time he had chosen personal loyalty over professional obligation, the first time he had been willing to sacrifice his career for his principles. The choice cost him not just his assignment, but also his relationship with the Oyakata's daughter, who couldn't understand why he had to leave if he wasn't going to complete his mission. Returning to the United States, Wade found himself emotionally and professionally adrift once again. The choice he had made in Japan had been morally correct, but it had also left him without clear direction or purpose. It was during this vulnerable period that he encountered Vanessa Carlisle, a teenage mutant who was working as a prostitute to survive on the streets of New York. Vanessa represented something entirely new in Wade's experience, someone who was as damaged and displaced as he was, but who had managed to maintain a fundamental optimism about the possibility of building something better. Their relationship developed quickly and intensely, fueled by mutual recognition of shared pain and shared hope. For the first time since his childhood, Wade found himself in a relationship where he didn't have to hide his darker impulses or pretend to be someone he wasn't. The love story between Wade and Vanessa was marked by a kind of desperate intensity that reflected both of their backgrounds. They were two broken people who had found something whole in their connection to each other. Two survivors who had decided to bet everything on the possibility that love might be strong enough to overcome the circumstances that had shaped them. Their shared dreams of a better life weren't naive fantasies. They were conscious choices to believe in possibilities that their experiences should have taught them were impossible. It was during this period of relative happiness and stability that Wade received his first high-profile assassination contract from Middle Eastern interests, seeking to eliminate a blind British government operative known as Blind. The assignment should have been routine: infiltrate the target's base of operations, eliminate the target, and extract cleanly. But when Wade arrived at the zero base where Al was located, something went wrong with his usual professional detachment. Instead of carrying out a clean assassination, Wade found himself killing everyone at the base except for his intended target. Whether this was a moment of unexpected mercy, a professional miscalculation, or something else entirely, Wade himself never fully explained. What mattered was that Blind Al escaped, and Wade's failure to complete his mission put both him and Vanessa in immediate danger from his employers. The consequences of Wade's failure in the Blind Al mission would ripple through his life in ways he couldn't anticipate at the time. His employers, unwilling to accept failure in such a high-profile contract, decided that revenge was more important than professional discretion. They targeted Vanessa, not to punish Wade directly, but to demonstrate the consequences of failing to meet their expectations. Vanessa was rescued by Zoe Culloden, an employee of the interdimensional firm Landau, Luckman, Lake and LeQuire, who had been keeping Wilson under surveillance because they believed he was destined to play a vital part in a potential threat to the world. This rescue was Wade's first encounter with the cosmic forces that would later play such a significant role in his life, though at the time he understood it only as an inexplicable piece of good fortune that had saved the woman he loved. The knowledge that his professional choices could endanger the people he cared about was devastating to Wade, but it paled in comparison to the news he received shortly after Vanessa's rescue. Medical tests revealed that he had developed 34 inoperable cancerous tumors throughout his body, a diagnosis that effectively handed him a death sentence with no possibility of appeal or reprieve. The cancer diagnosis represented the complete collapse of everything Wade had been trying to build with Vanessa. All their dreams of a better life, all their plans for escaping their respective pasts and creating something new together suddenly became impossible. Wade was faced with a choice between fighting a losing battle against his disease while watching Vanessa sacrifice her own future to care for him, or making the painful decision to walk away from their relationship to spare her that suffering. True to the pattern that had defined his life, Wade chose sacrifice over selfishness. He broke up with Vanessa not because he loved her less, but because he loved her too much to trap her in a relationship with a dying man. He even gave up his chemotherapy treatments, not wishing to prolong what he saw as an inevitable outcome that would only cause more pain to everyone involved. This decision revealed the fundamental decency that existed at Wade Wilson's core, even as it demonstrated the self-destructive tendencies that would complicate every relationship he tried to build. His willingness to walk away from love to protect the person he loved was genuinely heroic, but it was also a continuation of the pattern of abandonment and isolation that had defined his entire life. The period following his breakup with Vanessa was marked by a kind of resigned desperation. Wade had accepted his death as inevitable, but he hadn't yet found a way to make peace with the life he was leaving behind. He was a man with considerable skills and a strong moral compass, who was running out of time to find a way to use those qualities for something meaningful and lasting. It was during this dark period that Wade was approached by representatives of Department K, a special weapons development branch of the Canadian government, who claimed they might be able to cure his cancer. The offer seemed too good to be true, and Wade was experienced enough with government promises to be skeptical of any deal that seemed to offer something for nothing. But desperation has a way of overcoming skepticism, and Wade was running out of alternatives. The Department K representatives were careful to manage his expectations, explaining that their experimental program had risks and limitations, but they also offered him something that no conventional treatment could provide: hope. For a man who had already accepted his own death, even a small chance of survival was worth almost any risk. The decision to volunteer for the Department K program would prove to be the most consequential choice of Wade Wilson's life, though not in the way he had hoped or expected. The man who entered their facilities was a dying mercenary with a troubled past and a genuine desire to find some way to make his life matter before it ended. The creature that would emerge would be something entirely different, something that retained Wade's memories and core personality, but had been fundamentally transformed in ways that would affect every aspect of his existence going forward. As Wade signed the paperwork that would make him a test subject in Department K's experimental program, he couldn't know that he was taking the first step toward becoming one of the most unique and morally complex characters in the Marvel Universe. He was simply a man who had run out of conventional options and was willing to gamble everything on an unconventional solution. The choice to trust Department K with his life would cost Wade Wilson everything he had been and give him everything he would become. It was a trade he made blindly, desperately, and without any real understanding of what he was sacrificing or what he might gain in return. The facility that Department K directed Wade Wilson to was not the clean, high-tech medical center he had imagined when he agreed to participate in their experimental program. Instead, he found himself at a remote compound in the Canadian wilderness, a place where the architecture itself seemed designed to discourage hope rather than foster healing. The buildings were squat, utilitarian structures that looked more like a military installation than a hospital, and the personnel he encountered carried themselves with the kind of rigid professionalism that suggested they were more concerned with following protocols than with patient care. Wade's first indication that he might have made a terrible mistake came during the initial intake process, when he was informed that his participation in the program would require him to surrender all contact with the outside world for an indefinite period. The researchers explained that this isolation was necessary to prevent contamination of their experimental protocols, but Wade recognized the language of imprisonment when he heard it. Still, his desperation overrode his growing suspicions, and he allowed himself to be processed into the system like a piece of equipment rather than a human being seeking treatment. The Department K facility was actually a branch of the joint US-Canadian superhuman enhancement project known as Weapon X, though Wade wouldn't learn this designation until much later. The program's official mission was to create enhanced soldiers who could serve both nations' interests in an increasingly dangerous world, but its practical reality was far more sinister and experimental than its bureaucratic language suggested. The implementation of Wade's treatment involved the introduction of a healing factor derived from another Department K agent, Logan, though Wade wouldn't learn Wolverine's real name or the full extent of their connection until years later. The scientists explained that they would be introducing foreign genetic material into his system, material that had proven capable of regenerating damaged tissue at an accelerated rate. What they didn't explain was that this process would involve breaking down his existing cellular structure and rebuilding it according to parameters that were still largely theoretical. The early stages of the treatment seemed almost miraculous. Wade's cancer went into what appeared to be complete remission. His strength and reflexes improved dramatically, and he began to experience the kind of rapid healing that the researchers had promised. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Department K had actually delivered on their impossible promise to cure his terminal illness and transform him into something better than he had been before. But the human body, even one enhanced with extraordinary regenerative capabilities, was never meant to process the kind of genetic manipulation that Weapon X was attempting to achieve. Wade's healing factor began to interact with his cancer in ways that the researchers hadn't anticipated, creating a state of constant cellular warfare within his body. Rather than eliminating the cancerous tissue, his enhanced healing ability began regenerating it as fast as it was destroyed, locking him into a perpetual cycle of death and renewal at the cellular level. The physical effects of this process were immediate and horrifying. Wade's flesh began to break down and rebuild itself in irregular patterns, creating massive scarring and disfigurement that covered his entire body. His face, once handsome enough to attract women like Vanessa and the Oyakata's daughter, became a patchwork of scar tissue and malformed features that made him barely recognizable as human. But the physical transformation was only part of what Wade endured during his time at the Department K facility. The psychological trauma of watching his body tear itself apart and rebuild itself over and over again began to fracture his mental state in ways that would never fully heal. The constant pain, combined with the isolation from everything and everyone he had ever cared about, began to erode his sanity with the same relentless efficiency that the experiments were destroying his physical form. The researchers, led by a sadistic scientist known as Dr. Killebrew, showed no concern for Wade's suffering beyond its value, as data to be collected and analyzed. Killebrew was a man who had long since abandoned any pretense of medical ethics in pursuit of what he saw as the greater good of scientific advancement. To him, Wade was not a patient to be healed, but a test subject to be pushed to his absolute limits to see what those limits might reveal about the nature of human enhancement. Working under Killebrew was an equally sadistic assistant known as Ajax, though his real name was Francis Freeman. Where Killebrew was coldly clinical in his approach to torture, Ajax took personal pleasure in the suffering of his subjects. He seemed to view the experimental subjects not as human beings deserving of compassion, but as toys to be played with until they broke, at which point they could be discarded and replaced with fresh material. When Wade's healing factor began to destabilize and his cancer returned with a vengeance, the researchers at Department K declared him a failure and transferred him to what they euphemistically called the hospice. This facility was allegedly a government institution where failed superhuman operatives could receive care and comfort during their final days, but the reality was something far more sinister and experimental. The hospice was actually a laboratory where Dr. Killebrew and Ajax could continue their experiments on subjects who were no longer expected to survive. The patients served as unwilling test subjects for increasingly extreme procedures, their suffering justified by the theoretical knowledge that might be gained from studying their reactions to various forms of torture and mutilation. One of the most psychologically damaging aspects of life in the hospice was the betting pool that Ajax maintained among the patients. known as the Deadpool. This macabre gambling system required patients to wager on how long each of their fellow inmates would survive under the various experimental procedures they were subjected to. The Deadpool served multiple purposes for Ajax. It provided him with entertainment. It created additional psychological pressure on the subjects, and it fostered an atmosphere of despair and hopelessness that made resistance seem futile. Wade found himself trapped in this nightmare facility with no hope of rescue or escape. His healing factor kept him alive through procedures that should have killed him outright. But it couldn't prevent him from experiencing every moment of agony that Ajax and Killebrew inflicted upon him. The psychological torture of watching his fellow inmates suffer and die while knowing that his own suffering would continue indefinitely began to drive him toward a complete psychological breakdown. It was during this darkest period of his existence that Wade encountered death herself, not as a metaphor or a psychological construct, but as an actual cosmic entity who took a personal interest in his unique situation. Death had been watching Wade's suffering with fascination, recognizing in him a kindred spirit who existed in the liminal space between life and death. His healing factor kept him alive, but his cancer and the constant torture kept him perpetually on the brink of dying, creating a state of existence that death found both tragic and beautiful. Wade's relationship with death began as a romance born out of shared understanding of suffering and impermanence. Death offered him something that no living person could provide: acceptance of his condition without pity or attempts to fix what couldn't be fixed. In death's presence, Wade found a kind of peace that had been absent from his life since his childhood, a sense that his suffering might have meaning and purpose, rather than being simply random cruelty inflicted by an indifferent universe. The romance between Wade and death was conducted in stolen moments between torture sessions, brief encounters where she would appear to him in the space between consciousness and unconsciousness. These meetings sustained Wade through experiences that should have broken his mind completely, giving him something to live for even when living had become indistinguishable from dying. Death's love was the one pure thing in his existence, untainted by the politics and betrayals that had marked all of his earthly relationships. As Wade's suffering continued, he began to develop a desperate plan for reuniting with death permanently. Since his healing factor prevented him from dying naturally, he reasoned that he might be able to force the issue by provoking Ajax into killing him outright. Wade began taunting his tormentor relentlessly, calling him by his real name, Francis, over and over again with the kind of persistent mockery that he knew would eventually push the sadistic guard beyond his limits. The psychological warfare between Wade and Ajax became a battle of wills that transcended their roles as prisoner and guard. Wade's taunts were designed not just to provoke Ajax into killing him, but to strip away the man's carefully constructed persona and reveal the petty, insecure individual underneath the sadistic facade. Ajax, for his part, recognized that Wade was trying to manipulate him but found himself unable to resist the provocation, his own psychological instabilities, making him vulnerable to exactly the kind of needling that Wade specialized in. The campaign of psychological torture that Wade waged against Ajax had an unexpected side effect. It earned him the respect and admiration of his fellow hospice patients. These broken, dying people found in Wade's defiance a spark of hope and resistance that their own circumstances had beaten out of them. Wade became a symbol of the possibility that even in the most hopeless situations, human dignity and spirit could endure. Among the patients who looked up to Wade was a cyborg known as Worm, who had been subjected to brain surgery that left him with severely diminished cognitive abilities. Worm was the closest thing Wade had to a friend in the hospice, a gentle soul whose childlike innocence had somehow survived the horrors of their shared imprisonment. The friendship between Wade and Worm represented the last vestige of Wade's capacity for genuine human connection, a reminder that even in hell, people could still care about each other. Ajax's anger at Wade's constant taunting eventually reached the point where he decided that psychological torture wasn't sufficient revenge for the humiliation he was suffering. In a moment of sadistic inspiration, Ajax chose to hurt Wade in the most personal way possible by lobotomizing Worm, destroying the mind of the one person in the facility who still looked at Wade with friendship rather than fear or pity. The lobotomy turned Worm from a gentle, childlike figure into a barely functioning automaton, trapped in his own body, but no longer able to connect with the world around him. The sight of his friend reduced to this vegetative state was more devastating to Wade than any physical torture that Ajax had inflicted upon him. It was the final proof that in this place, even the small comforts of human connection could be stripped away at the whim of their captors. At death's prompting, Wade made the agonizing decision to end Worm's suffering by killing him, an act of mercy that violated every instinct he had developed about protecting the innocent and vulnerable. The murder of his friend was simultaneously the most compassionate and most traumatic act of Wade's life, a moment when love and violence became indistinguishable from each other. Under the rules that Dr. Killebrew had established for the hospice, any patient who killed another was to be executed immediately. Wade's mercy killing of Worm should have resulted in his own death, which was exactly what he had hoped to achieve. Ajax, following protocol, tore out Wade's heart and left him for dead, finally giving Wade what he thought he wanted most: release from his suffering and reunion with death. But Wade's desire for revenge proved to be stronger than his desire for peace. As he lay dying, his healing factor was jump-started not by any external stimulus, but by the sheer force of his hatred for Ajax and his determination to make the man pay for what he had done to Worm. His heart regenerated, his consciousness returned, and he found himself alive once again, but with a new sense of purpose that transcended his previous goals. Death, who had been waiting to welcome Wade into her realm, found herself abandoned as his healing factor pulled him back into the world of the living. The cosmic entity felt betrayed by Wade's choice to return to life rather than join her in death, and she withdrew from their relationship, leaving him alone with his regenerated body and his burning need for vengeance. Wade's resurrection was accompanied by a surge of strength and fury that allowed him to break free from the restraints that had held him during his execution. The hospice, which had seemed like an inescapable prison just moments before, suddenly became navigable as Wade's enhanced abilities and tactical training combined with his desperate need to escape. He fought his way through the facility's security systems with a combination of skill, luck, and sheer determination that surprised even him. The confrontation between Wade and Ajax was brief but decisive. Wade tracked down his tormentor and emptied 2 automatic rifles into him, leaving Ajax for dead in much the same way that Ajax had left him. The symmetry of the revenge was satisfying, but it couldn't undo the damage that had been done to Wade's body, mind, or soul during his time in the hospice. Taking the name Deadpool from the betting system that had been used to wager on his death, Wade Wilson emerged from the Department K facility as something entirely new. No longer the dying mercenary who had volunteered for an experimental treatment, but not yet the wisecracking anti-hero he would eventually become. He was something caught between life and death, between human and monster, between hero and villain, carrying within him the capacity for all of these roles, but not yet committed to any of them. The escape from the hospice was followed by a period of uncertainty and adjustment as Wade tried to figure out what his new existence meant and how he should use the abilities that his suffering had brought him. His scarred and disfigured appearance made it impossible for him to return to his old life or to reconnect with people like Vanessa, who had known him before his transformation. The face that looked back at him from mirrors was the face of a stranger, someone who shared his memories, but not his identity. Wade's first instinct was to use his new abilities in the service of violence and revenge, but his moral compass, damaged though it was, still pointed towards something approaching justice. He began working as an enforcer for various criminal organizations, but always with an eye toward targets who deserved what was coming to them. His reputation for effectiveness was matched by his reputation for unpredictability, as employers never knew whether Wade would complete a job as assigned or decide that the person who hired him was more deserving of punishment than the person he was hired to eliminate. The period immediately following his escape from Weapon X was marked by a kind of moral experimentation, as Wade tried to figure out how to use his new abilities in ways that felt consistent with his core values. He was no longer the idealistic young man who had refused to kill the Oyakata, but neither was he the broken victim who had been tortured in the hospice. He was something new, something unprecedented, and he had to create his own moral framework for this new existence. The transformation from Wade Wilson into Deadpool was not a single moment of revelation, but a gradual process of adaptation and evolution. The man who had entered the Department K facility, seeking a cure for his cancer, had died in every meaningful sense during his time in the hospice. The being who emerged was built from the same memories and core personality traits, but he had been fundamentally altered by experiences that no human should have to endure. Deadpool's early career as a costumed mercenary was marked by a search for purpose and identity that would continue for years to come. He knew what he was capable of, but he was still learning what he wanted to use those capabilities to achieve. The journey from dying man to reluctant anti-hero was just beginning, and the path forward would be marked by as many mistakes and false starts as victories and moments of genuine heroism. The choice to adopt a costume and codename represented Wade's acknowledgement that his transformation was complete and irreversible. He could never again be simply Wade Wilson, the mercenary with a moral code who fell in love with a woman named Vanessa and dreamed of a better life. That man was as dead as if Ajax's execution had succeeded. In his place stood Deadpool, a being whose very existence challenged conventional notions of heroism, villainy, life, and death. The emergence of Deadpool from the ashes of Wade Wilson's former life was not a triumphant rebirth, but a confused and painful process of learning to exist in a body and mind that had been fundamentally altered by trauma. The man who had entered the Weapon X program seeking a cure for cancer had been replaced by something that was neither fully human nor entirely monster, a being caught between categories in ways that made every aspect of existence complicated and uncertain. The first challenge Deadpool faced was simply figuring out how to live in the world when his appearance made normal human interaction nearly impossible. The severe scarring and disfigurement that covered his entire body marked him as something other than human. In the eyes of most people who encountered him, children ran screaming when they saw his face. Adults stared in horror or disgust, and even hardened criminals sometimes flinched when they found themselves in his presence. The psychological impact of this transformation was profound and lasting. Wade had never been vain about his appearance, but he had taken for granted the basic human privilege of being able to move through the world without causing fear or revulsion in others. The loss of that simple social acceptance was more isolating than any physical pain he had endured during his time in the hospice. A constant reminder that he no longer belonged in the world he had once inhabited. It was during this early period of adjustment that Deadpool made the decision to adopt a full-face mask as part of his costume. The mask served multiple practical purposes. It protected his identity, intimidated his enemies, and allowed him to move through the world without causing panic. But its most important function was psychological. Behind the mask, Deadpool could pretend, at least temporarily, that he was still capable of normal human interaction. That the face people were reacting to was a choice rather than a curse. The costume that Deadpool designed for himself during this period was a deliberate rejection of traditional superhero aesthetics, where heroes like Spider-Man wore bright, primary colors that symbolized hope and inspiration. Deadpool chose red and black, colors that suggested danger, violence, and the kind of moral ambiguity that defined his new existence. The design was practical rather than symbolic, built for function rather than inspiration, reflecting his understanding that he was not destined to be the kind of hero that children would look up to, or that citizens would cheer for. The weaponry that became Deadpool's trademark was acquired through a combination of his military training, his contacts in the mercenary world, and his growing understanding of what kinds of tools were best suited to his enhanced abilities. The twin katanas that became his signature weapons were chosen not just for their effectiveness in combat, but for their symbolic value. They represented a connection to the discipline and philosophy he had learned during his time in Japan, a reminder that violence could be conducted with honor and precision even when it served morally questionable purposes. His expertise with firearms, developed during his military service and refined during his years as a mercenary, took on new dimensions when combined with his enhanced reflexes and healing factor. Deadpool could take risks in combat that would be suicidal for normal humans, using his regenerative abilities as a tactical advantage that allowed him to absorb damage that would incapacitate or kill his opponents. This approach to combat was both effective and psychologically satisfying, allowing him to throw himself into violence with a recklessness that reflected his complicated relationship with his own mortality. The early jobs that Deadpool took as a costumed mercenary were carefully chosen to align with his evolving moral framework. While he was no longer the idealistic young man who had refused to kill the Oyakata, he retained enough of his original ethical compass to prefer targets who had earned their fate through their own actions. Corrupt politicians, drug dealers who sold to children, and criminals who preyed on the innocent became his preferred clients, allowing him to earn a living while satisfying his need to inflict justice on those who deserved it. One of his first encounters with the broader superhero community came through a confrontation with Wolverine, the man whose healing factor had been used as the template for Deadpool's own regenerative abilities. The meeting was not a friendly reunion between fellow Weapon X alumni, but a violent clash that revealed both the similarities and differences between the two men. Where Wolverine had managed to find a kind of peace through his association with the X-Men and his acceptance of his role as a hero, Deadpool remained caught between his desire to do good and his inability to fit into conventional heroic narratives. The fight with Wolverine was significant not just for its violence, but for what it revealed about Deadpool's evolving identity. He was no longer the broken victim who had been tortured in the hospice, but neither was he the confident hero that Wolverine had become. He was something new and uncertain, a being who possessed heroic instincts but lacked the moral certainty or social acceptance that would allow him to express those instincts in traditional ways. During this period, Deadpool began to develop the wise-cracking, irreverent persona that would become his trademark. The constant stream of jokes, pop culture references, and sarcastic commentary served multiple functions in his psychological ecosystem. On the surface level, the humor made him more entertaining and unpredictable, qualities that could be tactically useful in combat situations. But on a deeper level, the jokes served as a defense mechanism against the profound trauma he had experienced, a way of processing and deflecting emotional pain that might otherwise overwhelm him. The development of Deadpool's distinctive voice was not a conscious choice, but an organic response to his circumstances. The man who had once been Wade Wilson had been relatively serious and straightforward in his communication style, but the being who emerged from the hospice found that humor was one of the few tools that allowed him to maintain his sanity in a world that no longer made sense according to the rules he had once understood. The jokes also served as a way of maintaining distance from other people, preventing the kind of emotional intimacy that might lead to the sort of pain he had experienced when he lost Vanessa and Worm. By keeping everything light and surface level, Deadpool could interact with others without risking the kind of deep emotional investment that had caused him so much suffering in the past. It was during this period that Deadpool first encountered Taskmaster, the mercenary whose ability to mimic any fighting style he observed made him one of the most formidable opponents in the criminal underworld. Their initial meeting was both a professional conflict and a learning opportunity, as Deadpool discovered that his unpredictable fighting style and regenerative abilities made him one of the few opponents that Taskmaster couldn't easily counter. The relationship that developed between Deadpool and Taskmaster was emblematic of the kind of connections that defined this period of his life, professional rather than personal, based on mutual respect for each other's abilities rather than genuine friendship, and marked by an underlying tension that could erupt into violence at any moment. These relationships provided Deadpool with the social contact he needed to maintain his sanity while protecting him from the vulnerability that came with deeper emotional connections. Taskmaster served as both opponent and inadvertent teacher during this period, helping Deadpool refine his combat skills and develop new techniques that took advantage of his unique abilities. The sessions with Taskmaster were brutal and educational, pushing Deadpool to explore the full range of his regenerative powers, while teaching him how to fight opponents who were faster, stronger, or more skilled than he was. The training with Taskmaster also helped Deadpool develop a more sophisticated understanding of tactics and strategy. While his military background had given him a solid foundation in combat theory, his enhanced abilities required new approaches to warfare that traditional training hadn't prepared him for. Learning to use his healing factor as a weapon rather than just a defensive advantage opened up new possibilities for how he could approach both combat and problem-solving more generally. During this formative period, Deadpool also began to establish the network of allies and contacts that would support him throughout his career. The relationship with Weasel began during these early days, when Deadpool was still learning how to navigate the world as an enhanced being and needed someone who could provide him with specialized equipment and information without asking too many questions about his methods or motivations. Weasel represented a different kind of relationship than Deadpool had experienced with his fellow inmates in the hospice or his professional associates like Taskmaster. While not exactly a friendship in the traditional sense, their connection was based on mutual benefit and a kind of casual acceptance that was rare in Deadpool's experience. Weasel didn't judge Deadpool for his appearance or his methods, and Deadpool didn't expect Weasel to be anything other than what he was: a skilled technician who could provide useful services in exchange for payment and protection. The establishment of this support network was crucial to Deadpool's development during this period because it provided him with the resources and relationships he needed to operate effectively in the world without requiring him to conform to the expectations and limitations that governed normal human society. Weasel's workshop became a kind of sanctuary where Deadpool could be himself without pretense or performance. A space where his appearance and personality were accepted rather than merely tolerated. It was also during this period that Deadpool began his complicated relationship with Blind Al, the British operative whose assassination had been his final job before entering the Weapon X program. The decision to track down Al and essentially take her prisoner was motivated by a complex mixture of guilt, loneliness, and the need to maintain some connection to his past life as Wade Wilson. Al represented unfinished business from his previous existence, a reminder of both his failures and his capacity for mercy. The relationship between Deadpool and Blind Al was deeply problematic from its inception, marked by an imbalance of power that reflected Deadpool's inability to form healthy connections with other people. Al was not a willing companion, but a captive whose attempts to escape were prevented by Deadpool's abilities and resources. Yet within this fundamentally unhealthy dynamic, both characters found something they needed. Al found protection and purpose, while Deadpool found companionship and a connection to his humanity. The presence of Blind Al in Deadpool's life served as a constant reminder of the moral ambiguity that defined his existence. He was capable of genuine kindness and consideration toward her, providing for her needs and treating her with a respect that bordered on affection. But the foundation of their relationship remained coercive, based on his power to control her freedom rather than her choice to associate with him. This contradiction would plague their relationship throughout its duration, preventing it from becoming the kind of genuine friendship that both of them needed. As Deadpool's reputation in the mercenary community grew, he began to attract the attention of larger criminal organizations that were interested in recruiting his services for more significant operations. These opportunities provided him with better pay and more challenging assignments, but they also forced him to navigate the complex politics and moral compromises that came with working for powerful criminals who had their own agendas and methods. One of the most significant of these early employers was Wilson Fisk, the kingpin of crime, who recognized Deadpool's potential as an assassin and offered him lucrative contracts that tested both his abilities and his moral flexibility. Working for the kingpin exposed Deadpool to a level of organized criminality that was far more sophisticated and far-reaching than anything he had encountered during his previous career as a mercenary. The jobs he undertook for the kingpin were professionally satisfying but morally troubling, forcing him to confront the tension between his need to earn a living and his desire to use his abilities for purposes that aligned with his ethical framework. The targets that the kingpin selected were often people who deserved punishment for their crimes, but the context in which Deadpool was asked to eliminate them was frequently more about consolidating criminal power than about achieving justice. During this period, Deadpool also had several encounters with Spider-Man, the hero whose costume design had partially inspired his own visual aesthetic. These meetings were significant because they represented Deadpool's first sustained interactions with a genuine hero, someone who used enhanced abilities in service of protecting innocent people, rather than advancing personal or professional interests. The contrast between Spider-Man's approach to heroism and Deadpool's mercenary pragmatism was stark and illuminating. Where Spider-Man operated according to clear moral principles that prohibited killing and emphasized the protection of innocent life above all other considerations, Deadpool's moral framework was more flexible and situational, allowing for violence and even murder when he deemed it justified by circumstances. Yet, despite these fundamental differences in approach and philosophy, Deadpool found himself drawn to Spider-Man's example and occasionally frustrated by his own inability to measure up to the hero's moral standards. These encounters planted seeds of aspiration that would eventually grow into Deadpool's desire to become something more than just a mercenary, even if he never fully succeeded in becoming a traditional hero. The relationship with Spider-Man also highlighted Deadpool's growing awareness of his own moral complexity. While he was not willing or able to adopt Spider-Man's strict prohibition against killing, he began to develop a more sophisticated understanding of when violence was truly necessary and when it was simply convenient. This evolution in his ethical thinking would continue throughout his career, driven by his interactions with heroes who challenged his assumptions about right and wrong. As this formative period of Deadpool's career drew to a close, he had established himself as a unique presence in the Marvel Universe, neither fully hero nor complete villain, but something more complex and morally ambiguous than either category could contain. His reputation for effectiveness was matched by his reputation for unpredictability, making him a valuable ally and a dangerous enemy in equal measure. The foundation had been laid for everything that would follow in Deadpool's long and complicated career. He had developed his distinctive personality, established his professional methods, and begun the process of moral evolution that would define his character development for decades to come. The man who had died in the Weapon X hospice had been fully replaced by the merc with a mouth. But the journey toward becoming something approaching a hero was still in its earliest stages. The wisecracking, violence-prone mercenary who emerged from this period was recognizable as the character that fans would eventually come to love, but he was still missing many of the qualities that would make him truly compelling. He had learned to survive in his new existence and to use his abilities effectively, but he had not yet learned how to build the kind of meaningful relationships and moral commitments that would allow him to become something greater than the sum of his traumas and abilities. The years following Deadpool's emergence as a costumed mercenary were marked by a persistent and often painful search for the kinds of human connections that had been severed by his transformation. The man who had once been Wade Wilson had possessed a natural capacity for love and friendship, but the being who now wore the red and black mask found that his disfigurement and psychological damage made it nearly impossible to recreate the intimacy and trust that had characterized his earlier relationships. The first and most significant of these attempts at reconnection involved his former lover, Vanessa Carlyle, who had undergone her own transformation during the years since their separation. Vanessa had manifested mutant shape-shifting abilities and taken the codename Copycat, becoming a mercenary in her own right, while harboring complicated feelings about the man who had abandoned her to face his cancer alone. Their reunion was fraught with the kind of emotional complexity that comes when two people try to rebuild something that has been broken by circumstances beyond their control. The relationship between Deadpool and Copycat was complicated by the fact that both of them had changed fundamentally since their last meeting. Vanessa had developed her own survival mechanisms and professional identity, transforming from the vulnerable young woman Wade had known into a hardened operative who was more than capable of taking care of herself. Her ability to alter her appearance at will gave her a kind of control over her identity that Deadpool envied, allowing her to be anyone she needed to be while he remained trapped in his scarred and disfigured form. The dynamic between them was further complicated by Vanessa's resentment over Wade's decision to leave her rather than allowing her to support him through his illness. While she understood intellectually that he had been trying to protect her, emotionally she felt abandoned at the moment when their relationship should have been strongest. This underlying tension affected every interaction between them, preventing the kind of easy intimacy they had once shared, and replacing it with a carefully maintained distance that protected them both from further hurt. Wade's own feelings about their reunion were equally complex. He had never stopped loving Vanessa, but he was no longer the man she had fallen in love with, and he wasn't sure whether his feelings for her were genuine or simply nostalgia for a time when he had been capable of normal human relationships. The physical changes he had undergone made him deeply self-conscious about intimacy, while the psychological damage he had suffered made him question whether he was still capable of the kind of emotional vulnerability that love required. Their attempts to rebuild their relationship were marked by a series of advances and retreats, moments of genuine connection followed by periods of withdrawal and uncertainty. Both of them wanted to recapture what they had lost, but neither was sure whether that was actually possible, or whether they should even try. The past they shared was simultaneously a source of comfort and a barrier to moving forward, reminding them of what they had been, while highlighting how much they had changed. The professional complications of their respective careers added another layer of difficulty to their personal relationship. Both Deadpool and Copycat were mercenaries who operated in morally ambiguous environments, but their approaches to their work reflected different values and priorities. Wade had developed a preference for targets who deserved their fate, while Vanessa was more pragmatic about accepting jobs that paid well regardless of their moral implications. These differences in professional philosophy often translated into personal conflicts, as each of them struggled to understand and accept the choices the other made. Wade's growing desire to use his abilities for purposes that approached heroism was met with skepticism from Vanessa, who viewed such aspirations as naive given the realities of their world. Conversely, Vanessa's willingness to work for anyone who paid her fees troubled Wade, who had developed a more complex moral framework during his time as Deadpool. The relationship was further complicated by the presence of other Weapon X survivors in their lives. Individuals who shared their history of trauma and transformation, but who had responded to their experiences in different ways. These connections created a kind of extended family of the damaged. People who understood each other's pain, but who weren't necessarily able to help each other heal. Among these fellow survivors was Kane, a cyborg whose relationship with Copycat became romantic during a period when she and Deadpool were separated. Kane represented everything that Wade was not: controlled, disciplined, and apparently untroubled by the moral ambiguities that plagued Deadpool's existence. The triangle that developed between Wade, Vanessa, and Kane was painful for all involved, highlighting the ways in which their shared trauma had affected their capacity for healthy relationships. Wade's jealousy over Vanessa's relationship with Kane was complicated by his recognition that Kane might actually be better for her than he was. Kane could offer Vanessa stability and emotional consistency that Wade's psychological damage made difficult for him to provide. Yet the knowledge that he might not be the best choice for the woman he loved was devastating to Wade's already fragile sense of self-worth, forcing him to confront the possibility that his transformation had cost him not just his appearance, but his ability to be a good partner. During this period, Wade also encountered Teresa Cassidy, known as Sirin, a mutant with sonic abilities who was affiliated with the X-Force team. Siren represented a different kind of potential relationship for Wade, one not burdened by the weight of shared history and mutual trauma. Their connection developed slowly and organically, built on genuine compatibility and mutual respect rather than nostalgia or desperation. Siren's approach to Wade was refreshingly straightforward and accepting. She saw his scars and psychological damage not as obstacles to overcome, but as parts of his identity that she could accept without trying to fix or change them. Her own experience as a mutant who had faced discrimination and violence gave her a framework for understanding Wade's struggles that didn't require extensive explanation or justification. The relationship with Sirin allowed Wade to explore aspects of himself that he had thought were lost forever. Her presence brought out his capacity for tenderness and vulnerability, qualities that his mercenary lifestyle and traumatic experiences had forced him to suppress. With Siren, Wade could be simultaneously the damaged killer he had become and the decent man he had always tried to be, finding a balance between these aspects of his identity that had previously seemed impossible. Siren's connection to the X-Force team also provided Wade with his first real exposure to what it might be like to be part of a heroic organization. Through her, he met other mutants who used their abilities to protect innocent people and fight for causes larger than their own survival or profit. These encounters planted seeds of possibility in Wade's mind, suggesting that there might be alternatives to the isolated mercenary existence he had been living. The mentorship and friendship he developed with some of the X-Force members during this period was significant because it provided him with examples of how people with troubled pasts and dangerous abilities could still choose to be heroes. Characters like Cable and Wolverine had their own histories of violence and moral ambiguity, but they had found ways to channel their capabilities toward protecting rather than merely destroying. These relationships were not without their complications. Wade's unpredictable nature and tendency toward violence made him a problematic ally, even when his intentions were good. His habit of using lethal force against opponents who might have been subdued non-lethally created tensions within teams that preferred to avoid killing whenever possible. Yet his effectiveness in combat and his genuine desire to help made him valuable enough that these teams were willing to work with him, despite their reservations about his methods. The struggle to find acceptance within heroic communities highlighted one of the central conflicts of this period in Wade's life: his desire to be seen as something more than a mercenary killer, versus the reality that his appearance, methods, and psychological damage made it difficult for others to view him as a potential hero. He wanted to belong to something larger than himself, but he wasn't sure whether he was capable of the kind of moral consistency and emotional stability that heroism seemed to require. This internal conflict was particularly acute in his interactions with characters like Spider-Man, who represented the kind of hero Wade sometimes thought he might want to become. Spider-Man's unwavering commitment to protecting innocent life and his ability to maintain hope and humor, despite personal tragedy, served as both inspiration and reproach to Wade, showing him what was possible while highlighting how far he still had to go. The friendship that developed between Wade and Spider-Man was meaningful precisely because it crossed the usual boundaries between hero and mercenary, suggesting that redemption and growth were possible even for someone with Wade's history. Spider-Man's willingness to see potential goodness in Wade, despite his flaws, provided a kind of validation that Wade desperately needed, proof that he wasn't irredeemably damaged by his experiences. Yet these relationships with heroes also forced Wade to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his choices. The contrast between his methods and theirs made it clear that his journey toward heroism would require not just good intentions, but fundamental changes in how he approached conflict and violence. The realization that wanting to be better wasn't the same as actually being better was a painful but necessary step in his evolution. During this period, Wade also had to grapple with the discovery that he had a daughter named Eleanor, the result of a brief encounter with a woman named Carmelita Camacho during his early days as Deadpool. The knowledge that he was a father was both thrilling and terrifying, awakening protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed, while also forcing him to confront the reality that his lifestyle and psychological condition made him poorly suited for parenthood. The existence of Eleanor raised profound questions about Wade's priorities and responsibilities. His mercenary career had been built on the assumption that he was responsible only for himself and that his choices affected only his own well-being. The discovery that he had created life, that there was another person in the world who shared his genetic heritage and who might need his protection, challenged every assumption he had made about his place in the world. Wade's initial reaction to learning about Eleanor was a mixture of joy and panic. The thought that he might be able to experience the kind of unconditional love that comes with parenthood was appealing, but his awareness of his own psychological damage and dangerous lifestyle made him question whether he would be capable of providing the kind of stable, nurturing environment that a child needed. The decision about whether to become involved in Eleanor's life forced Wade to examine his own capacity for growth and change. Could someone with his history of violence and instability learn to be a good father? Was it fair to Eleanor to introduce her to a parent whose enemies might use her as leverage against him? These questions didn't have easy answers, but they forced Wade to think about his life in terms of legacy and responsibility. rather than just survival and personal satisfaction. The relationship with Eleanor's mother, Carmelita, added another layer of complexity to the situation. Carmelita had raised Eleanor without Wade's knowledge or support, creating a stable life for their daughter despite the circumstances of her conception. Wade's sudden appearance in their lives was disruptive and potentially dangerous, forcing Carmelita to weigh her daughter's need to know her father against her own instincts to protect Eleanor from Wade's chaotic world. The attempts to build a relationship with Eleanor were marked by the same patterns of advance and retreat that characterized Wade's other personal relationships during this period. His love for his daughter was genuine and powerful, but his uncertainty about his own capacity for parenthood made him cautious about becoming too involved in her life. The fear that he might somehow damage or endanger her kept him at a distance that was probably protective but was also profoundly painful for all involved. These personal struggles were playing out against the backdrop of Wade's continuing evolution as a mercenary and his growing involvement in larger conflicts within the Marvel Universe. His reputation for effectiveness and unpredictability made him a valuable ally in various cosmic and terrestrial conflicts. But his personal issues often complicated his professional relationships in ways that made it difficult for him to maintain the kind of focus and reliability that team membership required. The tension between Wade's personal needs and his professional obligations was particularly acute during this period because he was simultaneously trying to build meaningful relationships and establish himself as something more than just a gun for hire. The demands of his mercenary career often conflicted with his attempts to be present for the people he cared about, forcing him to make difficult choices between personal fulfillment and professional success. The search for belonging that characterized this period of Wade's life was ultimately about more than just finding people who would accept him despite his flaws. It was about discovering whether it was possible for someone who had been as damaged as he was to build the kind of meaningful, lasting connections that give life purpose and meaning. The relationships he formed during this time, with Vanessa, Sirin, Eleanor, and various heroes and fellow mercenaries, were all experiments in different ways of being human, different approaches to bridging the gap between who he had been and who he might become. The successes and failures of these relationships taught Wade important lessons about love, trust, and vulnerability that would inform his approach to human connection for the rest of his career. He learned that healing old wounds was possible, but not inevitable. That love could survive transformation, but might not survive neglect. And that the desire to protect the people you care about sometimes requires making choices that feel like abandonment. Perhaps most importantly, he learned that the search for belonging wasn't something that could be completed or resolved through any single relationship or achievement. It was an ongoing process of growth and discovery that required constant attention and effort, a commitment to remaining open to connection despite the risks that intimacy entailed. The relationships that defined this period of his life were not perfect or permanent, but they were real and meaningful, providing him with experiences of love and acceptance that proved such things were still possible for someone like him. The evolution of Deadpool from a solitary mercenary into someone capable of meaningful team membership was neither smooth nor inevitable, but it represented one of the most significant developments in his journey towards something approaching heroism. The man who had spent years learning to survive alone in a world that found him repulsive discovered that his unique combination of skills, experience, and moral flexibility could make him a valuable asset to organizations dedicated to protecting others, even if his methods and personality made him a challenging teammate. His first serious foray into team membership came through his association with X-Force, the militant mutant strike team led by the time-traveling soldier Cable. X-Force operated according to different rules than traditional superhero teams, employing lethal force when necessary, and focusing on proactive elimination of threats rather than reactive crime fighting. This approach aligned more closely with Deadpool's mercenary background and made it easier for him to contribute meaningfully without constantly violating the team's operational principles. Cable himself was a figure who commanded Deadpool's respect and attention in ways that few other characters had managed. Here was someone who combined military discipline with genuine heroic ideals, who had experienced his own share of trauma and loss, but had channeled those experiences into a commitment to protecting innocent people. Cable's approach to leadership was pragmatic rather than inspirational, focused on results rather than moral purity, which made him uniquely suited to working with someone as complicated and morally ambiguous as Deadpool. The relationship that developed between Cable and Deadpool was based on mutual professional respect that gradually evolved into something approaching friendship. Cable recognized Deadpool's effectiveness in combat and his genuine desire to make a positive difference in the world, while Deadpool admired Cable's unwavering commitment to his mission and his ability to make difficult decisions without being paralyzed by moral uncertainty. Their partnership was marked by the kind of odd couple dynamic that would become a recurring theme in Deadpool's relationships with more conventional heroes. Cable's serious, mission-focused approach to superheroism was constantly being tested by Deadpool's irreverent humor and unconventional tactics, while Deadpool's tendency toward chaos was balanced by Cable's strategic thinking and long-term planning. The dynamic worked precisely because both men brought complementary strengths to their partnership. Cable's temporal perspective and advanced technology provided resources and strategic advantages that Deadpool could never have accessed on his own, while Deadpool's unpredictability and willingness to take extreme risks made him capable of achieving objectives that Cable's more methodical approach might have struggled with. Working as part of X-Force gave Deadpool his first real experience of what it meant to be part of something larger than himself, to subordinate his individual goals and preferences to the needs of a group mission. This was not an easy transition for someone who had spent years learning to rely only on himself, but it was also profoundly satisfying in ways that his solo mercenary work had never been. The other members of X-Force presented Deadpool with a variety of relationship challenges and opportunities that forced him to develop new social skills and coping mechanisms. Each teammate had their own history, personality, and approach to their work, requiring Deadpool to learn how to adjust his behavior and communication style to work effectively with very different kinds of people. Domino, with her probability-altering abilities and professional mercenary background, was perhaps the easiest for Deadpool to understand and work with. She shared his pragmatic approach to violence and his understanding of the moral complexities that came with their line of work. Their relationship was marked by mutual professional respect and a kind of casual intimacy that didn't require deep emotional vulnerability from either party. Shatterstar, the genetically engineered warrior from another dimension, presented a different kind of challenge. His alien perspective on human society and relationships forced Deadpool to examine his own assumptions about social interaction and emotional connection. Shatterstar's literal-minded approach to communication and his struggle to understand human emotions served as a mirror for Deadpool's own difficulties with interpersonal relationships. The younger members of X-Force, characters like Richter and Cannonball, represented opportunities for Deadpool to explore his potential as a mentor and protector. These relationships were complicated by his own psychological damage and his uncertainty about whether someone with his history should be influencing younger, more idealistic heroes. Yet his genuine concern for their welfare and his desire to protect them from the kind of trauma he had experienced created bonds that were meaningful for all involved. Learning to function as part of a team required Deadpool to develop new skills that went beyond combat effectiveness and tactical thinking. He had to learn how to communicate his intentions and concerns to his teammates, how to accept input and criticism from others, and how to sublimate his individual preferences when they conflicted with group needs. Perhaps most challenging, he had to learn how to trust other people with his safety and well-being. His years of isolation and self-reliance had taught him that depending on others was dangerous and potentially fatal. But effective team membership required a level of mutual dependence that made such complete self-reliance impossible. The process of learning to trust his teammates was gradual and marked by numerous setbacks and misunderstandings. Deadpool's paranoia and defensive humor often created barriers to the kind of open communication that effective teamwork required, while his teammates sometimes struggled to distinguish between his genuine concerns and his habitual wisecracking. Yet the benefits of team membership were significant enough to motivate Deadpool to persist through these difficulties. Having teammates meant having backup in dangerous situations, access to resources and information that he couldn't obtain on his own, and most importantly, a sense of belonging and purpose that had been missing from his solo career. The missions that X-Force undertook during Deadpool's tenure with the team were significant not just for their strategic importance, but for what they taught him about heroism and moral responsibility. Working alongside people who were genuinely committed to protecting innocent lives forced Deadpool to examine his own motivations and methods, pushing him toward higher standards of conduct and more careful consideration of the consequences of his actions. One particularly significant mission involved the team's confrontation with Apocalypse, one of the most powerful and destructive mutants in existence. The scale and stakes of this conflict were beyond anything Deadpool had previously experienced, requiring him to think beyond his usual focus on immediate tactical concerns and consider the broader implications of their actions for the entire world. The experience of fighting alongside his teammates against such a formidable opponent was both terrifying and exhilarating. Deadpool discovered that his healing factor and combat skills, which had always been personal advantages, could be deployed strategically to protect his teammates and advance their collective mission. The knowledge that his actions were contributing to something genuinely important and heroic was profoundly satisfying in ways that his mercenary work had never been. The aftermath of major missions like the Apocalypse confrontation also provided opportunities for the kind of emotional processing and mutual support that Deadpool had never experienced in his solo career. The shared trauma and triumph of these experiences created bonds between team members that went beyond professional cooperation to approach genuine friendship. Yet Deadpool's integration into X-Force was not without complications and setbacks. His tendency toward lethal force sometimes conflicted with his teammates' preferences for non-lethal solutions, creating moral and tactical disagreements that had to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis. His unpredictable humor and behavior also sometimes interfered with mission parameters that required stealth or diplomatic sensitivity. The leadership challenges that Deadpool's personality presented for Cable were significant and ongoing. Cable had to learn how to harness Deadpool's effectiveness while managing his disruptive tendencies, finding ways to channel his chaotic energy toward productive outcomes without suppressing the qualities that made him valuable to the team. This balancing act required a level of patience and strategic thinking that tested Cable's leadership abilities in new ways. Traditional military discipline was ineffective with someone like Deadpool, who responded better to respect and inclusion than to authority and command. Cable had to develop new approaches to team management that accommodated Deadpool's unique personality while maintaining the operational effectiveness that X-Force's missions required. The experience of working with Deadpool also changed Cable in meaningful ways, forcing him to become more flexible and adaptive in his leadership style. Deadpool's irreverent perspective on their work sometimes revealed blind spots in Cable's thinking, or highlighted alternative approaches to problems that Cable's military background had conditioned him to overlook. The mutual influence that Cable and Deadpool exercised on each other was one of the most significant aspects of their partnership, Cable's steady presence and clear moral compass provided Deadpool with a model of what principled leadership looked like. While Deadpool's humor and unconventional thinking helped Cable avoid the kind of rigid thinking that could make leadership ineffective in rapidly changing situations. As Deadpool's tenure with X-Force continued, he began to internalize many of the team's values and approaches to heroism. The experience of working toward goals that went beyond personal survival or financial gain was transformative, giving him a sense of purpose and meaning that had been absent from his life since his transformation. The knowledge that his actions were contributing to the protection of innocent people and the preservation of a better world was profoundly satisfying. The relationships he formed with his X-Force teammates also provided Deadpool with his first real experience of chosen family since his transformation. These were people who had seen him at his worst and his best, who understood both his capabilities and his limitations, and who had chosen to stand by him despite his flaws and complications. The sense of belonging that came with X-Force membership was something Deadpool had been searching for since his emergence from the Weapon X facility. Here was a group of people who not only accepted him but valued him, who saw his potential for good even when he couldn't see it himself. The validation and support he received from his teammates was crucial to his ongoing psychological healing and moral development. Yet the very intensity of these relationships also made them fragile and complicated. Deadpool's fear of abandonment and his tendency towards self-sabotage sometimes manifested in behaviors that strained his connections with his teammates. His defensive humor and reluctance to show vulnerability made it difficult for others to provide him with the emotional support he needed, while his paranoia and trust issues sometimes led him to misinterpret their actions and motivations. The process of learning to maintain healthy relationships within a team context was an ongoing challenge that required constant attention and effort from Deadpool. He had to learn how to communicate his needs and concerns effectively, how to accept help and support from others, and how to provide the same kind of mutual aid that he was receiving. The development of these interpersonal skills was crucial to Deadpool's evolution as both a team member and a person. The experience of giving and receiving support within a group context taught him lessons about trust, vulnerability, and mutual dependence that would inform all of his subsequent relationships. Perhaps most importantly, his experience with X-Force taught Deadpool that heroism was not a solitary pursuit, but a collaborative effort that required people to work together toward common goals. The realization that he could be part of something larger and more meaningful than his individual survival was transformative, providing him with a framework for understanding his place in the world that went beyond his personal needs and desires. The legacy of his time with X-Force would continue to influence Deadpool's approach to relationships and heroism throughout the rest of his career. The lessons he learned about teamwork, trust, and mutual support provided him with tools and perspectives that would serve him well in all of his subsequent endeavors. The relationships he formed during this period remained important to him long after his formal association with the team ended, providing him with a network of allies and friends who continued to support his growth and development. The experience of being a valued member of a heroic organization gave Deadpool a taste of what he was capable of when his skills and instincts were channeled toward genuinely worthwhile goals. The knowledge that he could be an effective force for good in the world, that his presence could make a positive difference in the lives of others, was profoundly empowering and motivating. The development of Deadpool's medium awareness, his ability to perceive and interact with the narrative structures that contained his existence, was not a sudden revelation, but a gradual awakening that began with small anomalies and evolved into one of his most distinctive and powerful characteristics. This unique form of consciousness emerged from the intersection of his psychological trauma, his enhanced healing factor, and his exposure to cosmic forces that operated beyond the normal boundaries of reality. The first signs of Wade's expanding awareness manifested as intrusive thoughts and perceptions that seemed to come from outside his normal mental processes. During combat situations, he would occasionally experience moments where he could perceive the dramatic timing of events, as if someone were orchestrating the flow of action according to narrative principles rather than natural causality. These experiences were initially dismissed as symptoms of his psychological instability, but they persisted and grew stronger over time. The breakthrough moment in Wade's development of true medium awareness came during a particularly intense confrontation with cosmic entities who existed partially outside normal space-time. The psychic shock of encountering beings whose consciousness operated according to different dimensional parameters created a kind of conceptual rupture in Wade's perception of reality, allowing him to glimpse the underlying structures that governed his existence. The realization that he was a character in an ongoing narrative was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. On one level, it explained many of the seemingly inexplicable patterns and coincidences that had shaped his life. The way dramatic revelations always seemed to occur at crucial moments, the manner in which his relationships developed according to recognizable story beats, the tendency for his greatest enemies to return from apparent death just when he thought he was safe. But the knowledge also brought with it a profound sense of existential horror. If his entire existence was simply a story being told for the entertainment of others, what meaning could his choices and struggles possibly have? Were his feelings of love, loss, and moral responsibility genuine experiences, or simply scripted responses designed to create compelling drama for an audience he couldn't see or interact with? The initial period following Wade's full awakening to his fictional nature was marked by a kind of existential crisis that threatened to completely undermine his psychological stability. The knowledge that his most private thoughts and painful experiences were being observed and consumed by strangers was profoundly violating, while the recognition that his future was determined by the creative decisions of writers rather than his own choices filled him with a desperate need to assert some form of agency over his own existence. Wade's first attempts to use his medium awareness were crude and largely unsuccessful. He would try to address his audience directly during combat, breaking the fourth wall in ways that confused his opponents and allies alike. These early experiments with meta-commentary were driven more by psychological need than strategic thinking, representing his desperate attempts to establish some form of control over the narrative forces that governed his life. The development of a more sophisticated relationship with his medium awareness came through his encounters with cosmic entities who existed partially outside the normal flow of narrative causality. Beings like death, eternity, and the living tribunal operated according to principles that transcended individual storylines, giving Wade glimpses of the larger structures that contained and defined his reality. His relationship with death took on new dimensions once he became aware of his fictional nature. The cosmic entity's interest in him was no longer simply a matter of personal attraction, but reflected her fascination with a being who existed simultaneously within and outside the normal parameters of narrative mortality. Wade's healing factor prevented him from truly dying, but his medium awareness allowed him to perceive the metatextual reasons for this immortality in ways that death found both amusing and philosophically interesting. The romance between Wade and death became a kind of meditation on the nature of existence within fictional frameworks. Death could offer Wade the ultimate escape from his narrative prison by ending his story permanently, but such an ending would also destroy everything that made their relationship meaningful. The paradox created a tension that added depth to their connection while highlighting the unique philosophical problems that came with medium awareness. Wade's encounters with Thanos, the mad titan who was himself in love with death, took on additional complexity once Wade understood the meta-textual dimensions of their rivalry. Thanos' jealousy over Wade's relationship with death was not simply a matter of romantic competition, but reflected deeper concerns about narrative significance and the allocation of cosmic attention within their shared fictional universe. The curse that Thanos placed on Wade, preventing him from dying and thus joining death permanently, was revealed to be as much about narrative necessity as personal spite. Wade's immortality served important story functions that would be disrupted by his permanent removal from the narrative, making Thanos' curse simultaneously an expression of personal malice and an enforcement of metatextual requirements. Wade's growing understanding of these cosmic relationships allowed him to develop more sophisticated strategies for dealing with threats that operated on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. His medium awareness gave him unique insights into the motivations and limitations of beings who might otherwise be incomprehensibly powerful, allowing him to find weaknesses and pressure points that more conventional heroes might miss. The experience of participating in major crossover events like Secret Wars provided Wade with opportunities to observe and interact with the larger structures that governed the Marvel Universe as a whole. These reality-altering scenarios gave him glimpses of the editorial and creative processes that shaped his world, allowing him to understand how individual storylines fit into larger narrative frameworks and commercial considerations. During these cosmic events, Wade's medium awareness often made him uniquely valuable as both participant and observer. His ability to perceive and comment on the meta-textual dimensions of reality-threatening scenarios provided other heroes with insights they couldn't obtain through conventional means, while his immunity to certain forms of mind control and reality manipulation reflected his partial existence outside normal narrative parameters. The psychological burden of medium awareness was significant and ongoing. The knowledge that his most intimate moments and deepest traumas were being consumed as entertainment by an audience of strangers created a persistent sense of violation and exposure that affected every aspect of his relationships. The difficulty of maintaining genuine emotional connections when you know that those connections are being observed and evaluated by others was a source of constant stress and anxiety. Wade's characteristic humor and irreverence served as crucial coping mechanisms for dealing with the existential weight of his situation. The constant stream of jokes, pop culture references, and direct addresses to his audience allowed him to maintain some sense of agency and control over how his story was being told, even when he couldn't control the basic parameters of his existence. The development of his wise-cracking persona was not just a response to his physical and psychological trauma, but also a direct reaction to his growing awareness of his fictional nature. The jokes served multiple functions. They entertained his audience. They provided him with psychological defense against the horror of his situation, and they allowed him to assert his personality and perspective within the constraints of his narrative role. Wade's relationship with his audience became increasingly sophisticated as his medium awareness developed. He learned to anticipate their reactions and expectations, sometimes conforming to them for strategic advantage, and sometimes deliberately subverting them to maintain his sense of independence. This ongoing negotiation between creator, character, and audience became one of the defining aspects of his fictional existence. The ability to break the fourth wall also provided Wade with unique tactical advantages in combat and problem-solving situations. His capacity to access information from outside the normal flow of narrative causality sometimes allowed him to anticipate plot developments, understand hidden motivations, or perceive solutions that weren't apparent from within the story itself. Yet these advantages came at the cost of increased isolation from other characters who couldn't share his perspective on their shared reality. Wade's medium awareness created a barrier between him and his friends and allies that was often more significant than his physical disfigurement or psychological damage. The loneliness of being the only person who truly understood the nature of their existence was profound and persistent. The cosmic scope of some of Wade's adventures, particularly those involving time travel and alternate realities, provided him with additional perspectives on the nature of his fictional existence. Encounters with alternate versions of himself and his friends revealed the arbitrary nature of many of the defining characteristics of his reality, while experiences with time manipulation demonstrated the constructed nature of causality within narrative frameworks. These cosmic adventures also brought Wade into contact with beings whose existence transcended individual storylines and continuities. Entities like the Beyonder and the One Above All operated according to principles that encompassed multiple versions of reality simultaneously, giving Wade glimpses of the larger meta-textual structures that contained his universe and countless others like it. The knowledge that his reality was just one of many possible versions, and that other iterations of himself were living different lives according to different narrative requirements, was both comforting and disturbing. It suggested that his suffering and struggles were not unique or inevitable, but it also highlighted the arbitrary nature of the specific circumstances that defined his existence. Wade's interactions with cosmic entities often involved negotiations that operated on multiple levels simultaneously: personal, philosophical, and metatextual. His medium awareness allowed him to understand and address concerns that existed beyond the immediate plot requirements of any individual story, making him uniquely effective at resolving conflicts that might otherwise be intractable. The burden of cosmic knowledge that came with Wade's expanding awareness was balanced by the sense of purpose and meaning it provided. Understanding his role within larger narrative and metatextual frameworks gave his actions significance that transcended their immediate consequences, allowing him to find meaning in his existence, even when that existence was fundamentally artificial. The ongoing development of Wade's medium awareness represented a unique form of character growth that operated according to different principles than conventional psychological development. His journey toward greater understanding of his fictional nature was simultaneously a journey toward greater agency within the constraints of that nature, a process of learning to find freedom and meaning within the parameters of his narrative existence. The relationships Wade formed with other characters who possessed varying degrees of metatextual awareness created a kind of informal community of beings who understood the artificial nature of their reality without being completely paralyzed by that knowledge. These connections provided mutual support and understanding that was crucial for maintaining psychological stability in the face of existential uncertainty. The evolution of Wade's fourth wall-breaking abilities, from desperate psychological defense mechanism to sophisticated narrative tool, represented one of the most significant aspects of his character development during this period. Learning to use his medium awareness constructively rather than simply reactively required a level of acceptance and integration that took years to achieve. The ultimate significance of Wade's medium awareness lay not in its practical applications, but in what it revealed about the nature of identity, agency, and meaning within constructed realities. His journey toward understanding and accepting his fictional nature became a meditation on how consciousness and choice operate within predetermined parameters, and whether genuine growth and change are possible, even when the basic structures of existence are artificial. The cosmic perspective that Wade's medium awareness provided him transformed his understanding of heroism and moral responsibility, showing him that even fictional acts of courage and compassion could have real meaning and value within their proper context. This realization allowed him to embrace his role as a hero, despite his knowledge of its constructed nature, finding authenticity within artificiality and purpose within predetermined narratives. The recognition that his psychological state was as damaged and in need of healing as his physical body had been before his transformation marked the beginning of Deadpool's most challenging and important journey toward genuine recovery. The voices in his head, the dissociative episodes, the periods of extreme paranoia and depression, these were not quirky personality traits or amusing character flaws, but symptoms of profound trauma that required serious attention and sustained effort to address. The internal landscape of Wade's mind had become a battlefield, where multiple aspects of his personality competed for control, each one representing different responses to the overwhelming trauma he had experienced. There was the wise-cracking performer who used humor to deflect pain and maintain distance from others, the cold professional killer who could compartmentalize violence and moral complexity, the frightened victim who remained trapped in the endless cycle of torture and regeneration, and buried beneath all of these, the decent man who still believed in the possibility of doing good in the world. These different aspects of his personality were not simply moods or attitudes, but distinct voices with their own perspectives, motivations, and approaches to navigating his existence. The constant internal dialogue between these competing selves created a kind of psychological chaos that made consistent decision-making and emotional stability nearly impossible to achieve. Wade found himself making commitments as one aspect of his personality, only to have another aspect sabotage those commitments through contradictory actions. The yellow caption boxes that appeared in his consciousness, representing his internal monologue and self-aware commentary, were manifestations of his fractured psychological state rather than simply narrative devices. These voices provided running commentary on his actions and experiences, sometimes offering strategic insights and emotional support, but just as often undermining his confidence and reinforcing his sense of isolation from the normal world. The periods when these voices became overwhelming could last for days or weeks, leaving Wade barely functional and unable to maintain his relationships or professional responsibilities. During these episodes, he would isolate himself from his friends and allies, partly to protect them from his unpredictable behavior, and partly because he lacked the emotional resources necessary to maintain social connections while battling his internal demons. The recognition that he needed help beyond what his healing factor could provide was a crucial step in Wade's journey towards psychological recovery, but it was also one of the most difficult admissions he had ever made. His entire post-transformation identity had been built around self-reliance and the ability to survive anything through sheer stubbornness and regenerative powers. Acknowledging that some forms of damage couldn't be healed through willpower alone required a level of vulnerability that terrified him. His first serious attempt at seeking professional help came through his relationship with Dr. Bong, a former supervillain who had transitioned into psychiatric practice. The choice to work with someone who had their own history of criminal activity and moral ambiguity was strategic on Wade's part. He needed someone who could understand and accept his violent past without being judgmental or attempting to transform him into something he could never become. The therapeutic process was complicated by Wade's medium awareness and his tendency to treat even his most serious problems as material for jokes and performance. His sessions with Dr. Bong often devolved into comedy routines or meta-textual commentary that allowed him to avoid confronting the real emotional content of his experiences. Learning to engage seriously with his own psychological needs required developing new forms of self-discipline and emotional honesty that were foreign to his established coping mechanisms. The breakthrough moments in his therapeutic work often came through physical confrontation rather than traditional talk therapy. Wade's suggestion that he work through his issues by engaging in combat with Wolverine reflected his understanding that his body and mind were so interconnected that psychological healing might require physical expression of the Bayesian conflicts he was trying to resolve internally. The fight with Wolverine served multiple therapeutic functions simultaneously. On a practical level, it provided Wade with an opportunity to test his combat skills against someone whose abilities were similar to his own, reassuring him that his capacity for effective action hadn't been compromised by his psychological struggles. On an emotional level, it allowed him to express the rage and frustration that had been building up inside him without causing harm to innocent people or damaging his important relationships. The cathartic effect of the battle was immediate and significant. The physical exhaustion and endorphin release that came from extended combat helped to quiet the competing voices in Wade's head and provide him with a sense of clarity that had been absent for months. The recognition that Wolverine understood and accepted his need for this kind of violent release without judgment or condemnation was profoundly validating. Yet the therapeutic benefits of physical confrontation were temporary at best, and Wade's ongoing psychological work required more sustainable approaches to managing his mental health. The development of better coping strategies for dealing with his internal voices and dissociative episodes became a priority that would require years of sustained effort and numerous setbacks. One of the most significant challenges in Wade's psychological recovery was learning to distinguish between thoughts and impulses that represented genuine aspects of his personality and those that were manifestations of his trauma-induced mental fragmentation. The process of integration required him to identify which voices in his head represented authentic parts of himself that deserved acknowledgement and expression, and which were simply psychological artifacts that needed to be managed or dismissed. The work of psychological integration was complicated by the fact that some of Wade's most problematic mental patterns were also connected to his most valuable abilities. His paranoia and hypervigilance, while often excessive and socially damaging, had also saved his life in numerous dangerous situations. His emotional detachment and ability to compartmentalize violence, while barriers to intimate relationships, were essential tools for his professional effectiveness as a mercenary and hero. Learning to maintain his tactical advantages while reducing their negative impact on his personal life required a level of psychological sophistication that took years to develop. Wade had to learn how to access his professional mindset when it was needed for combat or dangerous missions while preventing it from dominating his interactions with friends, family, and potential romantic partners. The process of making amends for past actions and relationships damaged by his psychological instability was one of the most difficult aspects of his recovery work. Wade's tendency towards self-sabotage had hurt many people who had tried to get close to him over the years, and rebuilding trust with these individuals required consistent demonstrations of change rather than simply verbal apologies or explanations. His relationship with Vanessa, in particular, required careful reconstruction based on new patterns of communication and emotional availability. The woman who had once loved Wade Wilson needed to learn to trust and connect with the person Deadpool was becoming, while Wade had to prove that his efforts at psychological growth were genuine and sustainable, rather than temporary improvements that would eventually be undermined by relapse. The work of rebuilding damaged relationships was made more difficult by Wade's awareness that some of the people he had hurt might never be able to forgive him completely, regardless of how much he changed or how sincere his efforts at redemption became. This possibility forced him to confront the reality that genuine recovery might require accepting permanent consequences for his past actions while still pursuing healing for its own sake rather than as a means of earning forgiveness. His relationship with his daughter Eleanor became a particularly powerful motivator for psychological growth, as Wade recognized that his mental health issues could have devastating effects on a child who needed stability and emotional safety from her parent. The desire to be a good father provided him with concrete goals for his therapeutic work that went beyond his own comfort and well-being to encompass his responsibilities to another person. The challenge of maintaining his recovery while continuing to work as a mercenary and hero created ongoing tensions that required constant attention and management. The violence and moral ambiguity that were inherent parts of his professional life could trigger psychological symptoms and undermine the progress he was making in therapy, while completely abandoning his career would eliminate one of his most significant sources of purpose and identity. Finding ways to practice his profession while protecting his mental health required developing new approaches to mission selection, team collaboration, and post-mission processing of traumatic experiences. Wade learned to be more selective about the jobs he accepted, prioritizing assignments that aligned with his values and avoiding those that would require him to engage in activities that might re-traumatize him or reinforce his most problematic psychological patterns. The development of a stronger support network became crucial to Wade's ongoing recovery, as he recognized that his previous pattern of isolation and self-reliance had been both a symptom of his psychological damage and a factor that perpetuated it. Building relationships with people who could provide emotional support, practical assistance, and accountability for his recovery goals required learning new skills of vulnerability and reciprocity. His connections with other heroes who had their own histories of trauma and psychological struggle provided him with models for how recovery could be maintained, even within the demanding and dangerous world of superheroic activity. Characters like Wolverine and Cable had found ways to channel their own psychological damage into effective heroism, while still addressing their underlying emotional needs through therapy, medication, and mutual support. The ongoing nature of psychological recovery meant that Wade had to accept that his mental health would require constant attention and maintenance for the rest of his life. Unlike his physical injuries, which his healing factor could repair automatically, his psychological wounds needed conscious effort and sustained commitment to heal and remain healthy. The process of learning to manage his mental health symptoms while maintaining his effectiveness as a hero and his capacity for meaningful relationships became an ongoing balancing act that required constant adjustment and refinement. Wade had to develop the self-awareness to recognize when he was sliding towards psychological crisis and the self-discipline to seek help before his symptoms became overwhelming. The integration of his therapy work with his medium awareness created unique opportunities and challenges for his psychological recovery. His understanding of his fictional nature allowed him to gain perspective on his experiences and trauma that might not have been available to someone who believed their reality was completely authentic, but it also created additional layers of existential anxiety that conventional therapeutic approaches weren't designed to address. The development of his capacity for genuine intimacy and emotional vulnerability was one of the most significant achievements of Wade's psychological recovery work. Learning to allow other people to see and support him in his moments of weakness and uncertainty required overcoming years of conditioning that had taught him that vulnerability was synonymous with danger. The romantic relationships he formed during this period of recovery were qualitatively different from his earlier connections, marked by greater honesty, better communication, and more realistic expectations about what love could and couldn't accomplish. His relationship with Shikla, the undead queen who became his wife, provided him with opportunities to practice the relationship skills he was developing in therapy within a context of mutual respect and acceptance. The recognition that his psychological recovery was not a destination to be reached, but an ongoing process to be maintained became one of the most important insights of Wade's therapeutic journey. The goal was not to eliminate all traces of his trauma or to become a completely different person, but to develop healthy ways of living with his psychological scars, while still being able to form meaningful relationships and contribute positively to the world around him. The example that Wade's recovery provided to other heroes and civilians who struggled with their own mental health issues became one of the unexpected benefits of his therapeutic work. His willingness to speak openly about his psychological struggles and his commitment to seeking professional help helped to reduce stigma and encourage others to address their own mental health needs. The ongoing journey towards psychological healing that defined this period of Wade's life was marked by numerous setbacks, breakthroughs, and gradual improvements that reflected the complex and non-linear nature of trauma recovery. The man who emerged from this process was not cured or perfect, but he was significantly healthier, more self-aware, and better equipped to maintain the relationships and moral commitments that gave his life meaning and purpose. The integration of his therapeutic insights with his heroic activities created new possibilities for how he could contribute to the world around him, allowing him to use his experiences of psychological recovery to help others who faced similar challenges while continuing to serve as an effective protector of innocent people. The transformation of Deadpool from a niche comic book character into a cultural phenomenon that influenced storytelling across multiple media platforms represents one of the most significant character evolutions in modern popular culture. The journey from Rob Liefeld and Fabian Nicieza's initial creation, a straightforward parody of DC's Deathstroke, into a complex anti-hero whose influence extended far beyond the pages of Marvel Comics, was neither planned nor predictable, but it reflected broader changes in how audiences related to heroic narratives and moral complexity in entertainment. The early years of Deadpool's publication history saw him relegated to supporting roles and brief appearances in other characters' stories, his potential largely unrecognized by creators and editors who viewed him as little more than a convenient antagonist or comic relief character. The distinctive elements that would eventually make him beloved by fans, his fourth wall breaking, his moral ambiguity, his blend of tragedy and comedy, were present but underdeveloped, scattered across various storylines without the cohesive vision that would eventually transform them into a compelling character framework. The pivotal moment in Deadpool's evolution came with Joe Kelly's run on the character's first ongoing series, where Kelly recognized the untapped potential in Wade Wilson's unique combination of trauma, humor, and metatextual awareness. Kelly's approach to the character was revolutionary in its willingness to treat Deadpool's psychological damage seriously, while still maintaining the irreverent tone that made him entertaining, creating a template that would influence superhero storytelling for decades to come. The impact of Kelly's work extended far beyond the immediate commercial success of the Deadpool series. His approach to balancing comedy with genuine emotional depth, his willingness to acknowledge and subvert superhero genre conventions, and his development of Deadpool's distinctive voice created a new model for how comic book characters could engage with their fictional nature without sacrificing narrative coherence or emotional resonance. The proliferation of Deadpool variants across the multiverse became both a reflection of his popularity and a demonstration of the character's fundamental flexibility as a concept. Lady Deadpool, Kidpool, Dogpool, and dozens of other alternate versions of Wade Wilson proved that the core elements of his character, the regenerative abilities, the moral complexity, the metatextual awareness, the blend of tragedy and comedy, could be adapted to virtually any setting or demographic while retaining their essential appeal. This multiversal expansion served multiple functions within the broader Marvel Comics ecosystem. On a practical level, it provided creators with opportunities to explore different aspects of the Deadpool concept without being constrained by the continuity requirements of the main universe. On a thematic level, it reinforced the character's role as a commentary on the nature of fictional identity and the arbitrary nature of character development within shared universes. The Deadpool core, bringing together multiple variants of the character for shared adventures, represented the logical culmination of this multiversal expansion, while also serving as a meta-commentary on the tendency of comic book publishers to create multiple versions of popular characters. The concept was simultaneously a celebration of Deadpool's popularity and a satirical critique of the commercial imperatives that drove such proliferation. The influence of Deadpool on other Marvel characters and storylines became increasingly apparent as his popularity grew. Heroes and villains began incorporating elements of his approach: the self-aware humor, the willingness to acknowledge genre conventions, the blend of violence and comedy, into their own characterizations. This influence was particularly noticeable in team books and crossover events, where Deadpool's presence often shifted the tone and approach of entire storylines. The character's role in major Marvel events like Secret Wars, Civil War, and various cosmic crossovers demonstrated his evolution from peripheral figure to central player in the Marvel Universe's most significant storylines. His unique perspective on the nature of heroism and his ability to operate outside conventional moral frameworks made him valuable in situations where traditional approaches had failed or proven inadequate. The relationship between Deadpool and other major Marvel characters evolved significantly during this period, moving beyond simple antagonistic or comedic interactions to develop genuine depth and complexity. His partnerships with characters like Spider-Man, Wolverine, and Cable became sources of mutual growth and development, with each relationship bringing out different aspects of his character, while also influencing his partners in meaningful ways. The mentorship role that Deadpool occasionally adopted with younger heroes represented one of the most significant developments in his character evolution. His willingness to share his hard-earned wisdom about survival, moral complexity, and the costs of heroism provided valuable guidance to characters who were struggling with their own development, while also demonstrating his own growth from purely self-interested mercenary to someone who cared about the welfare of others. The expansion of Deadpool into other media platforms began with animated appearances that translated his distinctive personality and humor to television audiences who might never have encountered him in comic book form. These early adaptations faced the challenge of maintaining his essential character while adapting him for different audience demographics and content standards, a process that required creative solutions to preserve his appeal while making him accessible to broader audiences. The development of Deadpool video games provided opportunities to explore interactive applications of his abilities and personality, allowing players to experience his combat skills and irreverent humor in ways that passive media couldn't replicate. The success of these games demonstrated that his appeal extended beyond traditional comic book audiences to include gamers who appreciated his unique blend of action and comedy. The most significant media expansion came with the development of Deadpool feature films, which faced the enormous challenge of translating a character whose most distinctive feature was his awareness of his fictional nature into a medium where such awareness would be even more disruptive to narrative conventions. The success of these films in maintaining Deadpool's essential character while creating compelling cinematic experiences demonstrated both the strength of the character concept and the skill of the creative teams involved. The cultural impact of the Deadpool films extended far beyond their commercial success, influencing approaches to superhero storytelling across multiple studios and franchises. The willingness to embrace rated content, metatextual humor, and morally ambiguous protagonists in superhero films became more common following Deadpool's success, suggesting that audiences were ready for more sophisticated and varied approaches to heroic narratives. The academic and critical attention that Deadpool began to receive during this period reflected his evolution from simple entertainment to a complex cultural artifact worthy of serious analysis. Scholars in fields ranging from literary criticism to psychology found in his character rich material for examining topics like trauma, recovery, narrative self-awareness, and the relationship between commerce and art in popular culture. The therapeutic and inspirational value that many fans found in Deadpool's story became an unexpected but significant aspect of his cultural impact. His journey from trauma victim to functioning hero, his struggles with mental health issues, and his eventual development of meaningful relationships provided a model for recovery and growth that resonated with readers facing their own challenges. The representation of mental health issues in Deadpool's character was particularly significant because it avoided both the stigmatization and the romanticization that often characterizes such portrayals in popular media. His psychological damage was presented as a genuine obstacle to overcome rather than a source of special insight or romantic appeal, while his recovery was shown to be an ongoing process requiring sustained effort rather than a dramatic transformation. The influence of Deadpool on comic book writing and artistic approaches became evident in the work of creators who had grown up reading his stories and were now contributing to the medium themselves. The integration of meta-textual elements, the willingness to blend comedy with serious themes, and the development of morally complex protagonists became more common throughout the industry, partly as a result of the path that Deadpool had helped to establish. The commercial success of Deadpool-related merchandise, from clothing and accessories to collectibles and home goods, demonstrated his transformation from niche comic book character to mainstream cultural icon. The distinctive visual design of his costume and the memorability of his catchphrases made him highly marketable across a wide range of products and demographics. The educational applications of Deadpool's character became apparent as teachers and educational content creators recognized the potential for using his stories to discuss complex topics like trauma, recovery, moral reasoning, and narrative structure. His combination of accessibility and depth made him an effective vehicle for introducing sophisticated concepts to students who might otherwise find such topics intimidating or boring. The international appeal of Deadpool demonstrated the universality of the themes and conflicts that defined his character. Despite his specifically American cultural references and contexts, his struggles with identity, belonging, moral complexity, and psychological recovery resonated with audiences across different cultures and languages, suggesting that these concerns transcend specific cultural boundaries. The evolution of fan communities around Deadpool reflected broader changes in how audiences engaged with fictional characters and narratives. The active participation of fans in creating content, analyzing storylines, and building communities around shared interests became a significant factor in the character's continued popularity and cultural relevance. The influence of fan creativity on official Deadpool content became increasingly apparent as creators recognized the value of engaging with fan communities and incorporating fan insights into their work. This collaborative relationship between creators and audiences represented a new model for how popular culture properties could evolve and develop over time. The philanthropic and social awareness campaigns that utilized Deadpool's popularity for charitable causes demonstrated the potential for fictional characters to serve as vehicles for positive social change. The character's association with causes related to mental health awareness, veterans support, and cancer research reflected the serious themes underlying his comedic exterior. The legacy of Deadpool's impact on popular culture was evident not just in direct imitations and homages, but in the broader acceptance of genre-bending, metatextual, and morally complex approaches to heroic storytelling. His success helped to expand the possibilities for what superhero narratives could be and do, creating space for more diverse and sophisticated approaches to these fundamental cultural myths. The ongoing evolution of Deadpool's character and influence suggested that his impact on popular culture was far from complete. As new generations of creators and audiences encountered his stories, they continued to find new meanings, applications, and interpretations that kept the character relevant and vital. The foundation that had been established through decades of development provided a platform for continued growth and innovation that could adapt to changing cultural needs and interests. The recognition of Deadpool as a legitimate subject for scholarly analysis and cultural commentary represented the final transformation of a character who had begun as a simple parody into a complex cultural phenomenon worthy of serious attention. His journey from the margins of comic book publishing to the center of popular culture discussions about heroism, trauma, and narrative innovation demonstrated the potential for even the most unlikely characters to achieve lasting significance and influence. As we reach the end of our journey through the chaotic, heartbreaking, and ultimately hopeful story of Wade Wilson, we're left with something remarkable. Here is a character who began as a broken man facing death, who was twisted by experiments into something supposedly monstrous, yet who found ways to become genuinely heroic despite, or perhaps because of, his damage. Deadpool's story reminds us that healing isn't always about returning to what we were before. Sometimes it's about accepting what we've become and finding ways to make that work for something good. His journey from dying mercenary to wise-cracking anti-hero to genuine, if unconventional, hero shows us that even the most damaged among us can find purpose, family, and redemption. The merc with a mouth continues to regenerate, not just physically but emotionally and morally, always growing, always changing, always surprising us with moments of genuine heart beneath the crude humor and violence. In a universe of gods and monsters, perhaps what makes Wade Wilson truly special is that he remains, despite everything, profoundly human. So rest now, mercenaries, and dream of healing that goes deeper than flesh and bone, of families that choose each other, and of the possibility that even our deepest scars can become sources of strength.